We're going to start our discussion of Black feminism with Sojourner Truth's Ain't I a Woman? And I'd highly recommend that you go listen to the speech first. And we're only going to make a couple cursory statements about it. The primary purpose for us reading this is that it's regarded as one of the most important early statements of Black feminism in the history of feminism. And I think that Kimberly Crenshaw gives a nice account for what's so significant about it. In her description, in 1851, at the Women's Rights Conference in Akron, Ohio, there were white men that were heckling speakers. They were invoking stereotypical images of womanhood, that women were too frail and delicate to participate in politics, and thus they did not deserve the right to vote or to participate in other more public affairs. And Sojourner Truth rose to speak, even though at the time or in the conference, many white women urged her to be silent. Eventually, she was allowed to speak, and you can listen to her speech. And in it, she talks about the horrors of slavery, its impact on Black women, and she reveals the contradiction. Largely most significant for us is this contradiction between certain ideological myths of womanhood and the reality of Black women's experience. And this theme of these ideas of what it is to be a woman, who counts as a woman, what is womanhood, what is sisterhood, those ideas have largely been cast in a particular lens. In this case, a racist lens. And this conflicts with a lot of Black women's experience. And so a feminism or a concern with gender injustice should be sensitive to the ways that Black women experience sexism by being Black women, as well as how they experience racism by virtue of being Black women. So the two challenges that Sojourner Truth gave, the first was to patriarchy, was to the white men that claiming that women were weak. So in her speech, she spends a lot of time saying that she is just as capable as men. She can do just as much work, eat just as much food, and so on. So the argument that women do not deserve equal rights because they aren't as capable would be incorrect in this case. And then the second audience that she's speaking to is this idea of, quote, true womanhood. So Black women weren't something or aren't something less than real women, quote unquote, whose experiences have no bearing on true womanhood. Her challenge to the white women, the white suffragists at the moment, where it was to highlight that, look, aren't I a woman too, right? Ought I also be included in the space of feminist concern? So we're going to continue our discussion of Kimberly Crenshaw, her work, Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a 1980s article. Kimberly Crenshaw, if you're not familiar, is the feminist theorist who coined the term intersectionality. And we'll talk about that term here. It is particularly relevant for the theme of our course, as our course is largely interacting with theories about gender and politics in what we'd call the third wave of feminism. Now, our attention on Black women, she wants to argue, shows how dominant conceptions of discrimination condition us to think about subordination as disadvantage along a single categorical axis. So we might call this the standard view, that you are discriminated by virtue of your race or your gender or your class, and that everyone who is a member of the similar class as you suffers the same type of subordination. So everyone who is everyone who is Black is experiencing discrimination on the grounds of their race, just in the same way as each other. But Kimberly Crenshaw wants to argue that this is not the way we should look at it. We should have an intersectional interpretation. So a nice quote from her: because intersectional experience is greater than the sum of racism and sexism, any analysis that does not take intersectionality into account cannot sufficiently address the particular manner in which Black women are subordinated. So the challenge here is that there is no Black experience. There is no woman's experience that all Black people have in common, or all women have in common. Or at least these ideas really need to be recast and re-understood. So the core idea that she's going to walk through in this article is to say, look, this is how failure to recognize intersectionality can particularly disenfranchise or subordinate or oppress or discriminate against Black women in particular. So she picks out 3 legal cases in particular. So the de Graaf and Reed versus General Motors, the Moore versus Hughes helicopter, and the Payne versus Travenol cases. So I'm not going to go through each of these cases in great detail. You can read more about them in the lecture, in the actual paper. But what I will do is go through each of these details so that we can understand what the theoretical upshots of these are. So the details of the de Graaf and Reed versus General Motors case is that this is a claim that hiring policies explicitly discriminated against Black women in particular. The ruling of the court was to dismiss the sex discrimination complaint on the grounds that other women, white women, worked at GM. So they were saying then there's no sex discrimination here. The court then also dismissed the race discrimination complaint, contending that it really should just be combined in its case with another. So the court refused to recognize that there was this category Black woman, or if the way that they read the anti-discrimination law is that Black woman was not a protected category. Women were a protected category. Sex was a protected category. Being Black or race was a protected category, but not them together. So Black women could then only be covered if understood as Black or as women. So that's one way that a certain injustice can be done. If Black women are being discriminated against by virtue of being Black women, this is not getting picked up by the standard view. In the Moore versus Hughes helicopter, this is another workforce complaint where discrimination was shown in promotion and access to supervisory positions. Statistical details show that there was significant disparity between men and women, and some between Black and white men. So the ruling here was a little different. The court refused to certify Moore as a class representative in the sex discrimination complaint on behalf of all females. So this reading interprets anti-discrimination doctrine to apply, or it takes as paradigmatic, white female experiences when considering gender or sex discrimination. So the idea here is that Black women can't represent white women, and so they can't take their case to court on the grounds of sex discrimination when it intersects with their race. So the upshot here is that complaints of white females, to use her language, are taken to be the standard gender or sex discrimination claim, while anything that diverges from that is going to be a hybrid claim of some sort. It's a race and a gender claim. Black females here are not seen to represent white females. She thinks that the effect of this approach is that even though a challenged policy or practice may clearly discriminate against all females, the fact that it has particularly harsh consequences for Black females places Black female plaintiffs at odds with white females. So she thinks that there raises a tension here between Black female representation and white female representation. In the Payne v. Travenol case, something kind of similar happened, but kind of on the side of race. So the court refuses to allow the plaintiffs, Black females, to represent Black males. The court then granted the request to narrow the case to Black women only. So there's a bit of a difference here from this case and the de Graaf and Reed case, where the de Graaf and Reed case, they said, no, Black women's not protected. The Payne v. Travenol case said, no, you can't represent a race claim. This has to be only understood as Black women being affected. So the court did find extensive racial discrimination and did award back pay to Black female employees, but it did not remedy the losses experienced by Black men. So the upshot here is that Black women are also, not only are they not seen as representative of women in general, but they are also not seen as representative of Black folks in general. So her analysis is that even though Travenall was a partial victory for Black women, the case specifically illustrates how anti-discrimination doctrine generally creates a dilemma for Black women. It forces them to choose between specifically articulating the intersectional aspects of their subordination, thereby risking their ability to represent Black men, or by ignoring that intersectionality in order to state a claim that would not lead to the exclusion of Black men. And so this is a hard space to be in. I'll flag, obviously, I am white, I am not Black, I do not experience this kind of connection between my gender and my race in the same way as women of color or Black women experience it. But what it seems that Crenshaw is pointing at is this kind of bind that Black women have in particular. Do they play down certain key aspects of their identity so that they can uplift those that are members of the same race, are sharing in the same kind of racial oppression? Or do they live that, do they live that up, or do they identify that so they can satisfy the particular ways that their gender and race intersects, but at the cost of not helping out people who are co-oppressed by virtue of their race? And we can imagine that this pressure could be reinforced by one's community. So there might be pressures for Black women to suppress certain kinds of gendered pursuits or goals of alleviating oppression to benefit, namely Black men in their community. So what's the significance of this doctrinal treatment of intersectionality? So she thinks that these are the issues that stem from a particular definition of discrimination. Wrongful proceeds from the identification of a specific class or category. So this is the particular definition that the courts tend to work with. The idea of discrimination is that there are wrongful proceeds from the identification of a specific class or category. Either discriminatory intentionally identifies this, this should say discriminator. Either discriminator intentionally identifies this category, or a process is adopted by which somehow disadvantages all members of this category. So what's going on here? The idea is that there are some wrongful proceeds, something wrong happens from the identification of a specific class. So I identify you as Black, therefore I wrongfully withdraw certain benefits from you or impose certain burdens. And this discriminator, the person who's doing the discrimination, intentionally identifies this category. So there's this intentional discrimination that happens. Or they follow a process by which these disadvantages carry out towards all members of that category. So this could be a kind of tendency to not hire people of a particular race or of a particular gender. So a first point that we can make, on this view, a discriminator treats all members similarly. So any significant variation suggests that the group is not being discriminated against, or that conflicting interests exist which defeat any attempts to bring a common claim. So this is a problem in the sense that if you are a woman and you are Black, your experience will be probably different, though in a lot of ways similar to the experiences of Black men. But if you have that variation, then it's hard to make the claim that the kind of discrimination that's at play is due just because of your race. It's perhaps due because of your race and your gender. And that's exactly the kind of claim that was made in Payne v. Travenall. A second point is that this view just addresses the use of race or gender in ways which would otherwise be fair or neutral. So this implies that non-discrimination law only regulates the extent to which race or sex interferes with the process of determining outcomes. By consequence, sex and race discrimination are defined in terms of the experiences of those who are privileged, but for their racial or sexual characteristics. So the idea is, if you did not have these pieces of your identity, then you would be privileged, or you would be experiencing no discrimination. And we'll look at her basement metaphor to think about this. And you can look at this on page 151. So she says here, to the extent that this general description is accurate, the following analogy can be useful in describing how Black women are marginalized in the interface between anti-discrimination law and race and gender hierarchies. So she asks us to imagine a basement which contains all people who are disadvantaged on the basis of race, sex, class, sexual preference, age, and or physical ability. These people are stacked, feet standing on shoulders, with those on the bottom being disadvantaged by the full array of factors up to the very top, where the heads of all those disadvantaged by a singular factor brush up against the ceiling. Their ceiling is actually the floor above which only those who are not disadvantaged in any way reside. So if you want to think of this, you have a basement, then you have a floor above, and the people that are walking around the floor are people that are not disadvantaged in any way. So maybe these are people that are white, they're cis, they're heterosexual, they're men, and they are wealthy, and they're fully able-bodied and whatnot. So in efforts to correct some aspects of domination, those above the ceiling admit from the basement only those who can say that but for the ceiling, they too would be in the upper room. So then a hatch is developed through which those placed immediately below can crawl. Yet this hatch is generally available only to those who, due to the singularity of their burden and their otherwise privileged position relative to those below, are in the position to crawl through. Those who are multiply burdened are generally left below unless they can somehow pull themselves into the groups that are permitted to squeeze through the hatch. So if you think of this, this is like saying there are people in the basement that are disadvantaged solely because of class, solely because of their race, solely because of their gender, and so on. And those people are very close to the ceiling. And if we're only concerned with anti-discrimination policies that take those kinds of situations and say, okay, well, but for that one category, if we just fix that, then here you are, you're welcomed to the top level or the top story. But this is a problem for those who are experiencing discrimination based on multiply intersecting parts of their identity. So as this analogy translates for Black women, the problem is that they can receive protection only to the extent that their experiences are recognizably similar to those whose experiences tend to be reflected in anti-discrimination doctrine. If Black women cannot conclusively say that but for their race or but for their gender they would be treated differently, then they are not invited to climb through the hatch, but instead told to wait in the unprotected margin until they can be absorbed into the broader protected categories of race and sex. And this has problems for emancipatory or anti-racist or feminist projects. So despite the narrow scope of this dominant conception of discrimination and its tendency to marginalize those whose experiences cannot be described within its tightly drawn parameters, this approach has been regarded as the appropriate framework for addressing a range of problems. So in much feminist theory, and to some extent in anti-racist politics, this framework is reflected in the belief that sexism or racism can be meaningfully discussed without paying attention to the lives of those other than the race, gender, or class privileged. As a result, both feminist theory and anti-racist politics have been organized in part around the equation of racism with what happens to the Black middle class or to Black men, and the equation of sexism with what happens to white women. And so this is the crux of the criticism of at least these earlier statements of Black feminism against the second wave feminist, white feminist approaches that had heretofore been the bread and butter of feminist movements. So she advances further that why should we at all be framing discrimination, sexism, and racism using the most privileged as our baseline of comparison? And that's a real sticking point. So what are some issues for feminism, or how does this intersect with specific projects of feminism? So women of color tend to be overlooked, and their exclusion is enforced when white women speak for women of color and when they speak as women. So white women usually, this is the criticism, take their voice to be authoritative and universal. But white feminism by doing so, ignores how race mitigates aspects of sexism and how it privileges some women in the domination of other women. So she says that there are two cases where you can see this. This happens in the separate spheres literature and concerns and issues of feminism and the issues of rape. So if you're not familiar, the separate spheres view has a long tradition in liberal theory in particular, but it's this idea that there is a public sphere and a private sphere. And in the public sphere, this is subject to law and enforcement. It's an area of usually male membership and participation. It's the space of public office, of voting, and so on. It's very much aligned with being active in the public. And then there's the private sphere, and this is a domain that's supposed to be protected from legal intervention. If you were to follow John Stuart Mill, it's this idea that it is a domain in which the individual is sovereign, and this generally includes the area of the home and the domestic sphere. So in this case, man is taken to be sovereign under a patriarchal order or structuring, and women are relegated to that sphere under the supervision of men. So if you can recall your classic kind of depiction of the housewife in the 1950s, that a woman is, her domain is in the home, but the father or the husband is the one that's particularly in charge of the major decisions at the end of the day. And it's in fact the husband that owns the house then and dictates to the wife how to act and whom can be friends and so on and so forth. So within these two spheres, or within this discussion, there are generally these gender norms associated with them. So since men are primarily going to be active in the public sphere, they are raised to be independent, to be told that they're capable and powerful, while women are supposed to be weak or dependent or limited and passive, as befitting their domestic roles. So Crenshaw wants to point out that this framing that feminists tend to make largely ignores Black experience. So Black men tend not to be viewed as powerful, nor are Black women simply passive or dependent and limited. Recognizing this, we might be able to see what is behind the idea of this claim of the pathological matriarch, or why certain Black liberation movements aspire to create intentionally patriarchal institutions. So here's a little bit of a criticism on her part of Black liberation movements, that sometimes, according to her, that there's a striving for establishing the kinds of patriarchal order that is even seen in white society as almost a standard of liberation from racial oppression, but at the same time, that can be problematic for Black women. There's even another nefarious kind of interpretation that can happen here, which is that white women might think that Black women don't share certain experiences that white women are trying to fight for. So in the second wave of feminism, largely white women were trying to push their way into the workforce. I think the natural extension of that maybe not natural extension, but an extension of that in a contemporary scenario or circumstances would be something like lean-in feminism. And so white women might say, hey, we want to get out of the domestic sphere. We want to get out of the private sphere and enter the public sphere. Part of that is to operate in firms and whatnot. And so that's like a key goal of our feminist movement. But Black women might stand around and point out that, hey, look, we have been working in the workforce. Black women have long been participants in the labor force. That suggests that perhaps on this reading of the separate spheres view, that women Black women in particular, are working in activities that are usually reserved for men. So someone might misstep and think, therefore, Black women are not experiencing this kind of patriarchy. But Crenshaw wants to say, look, doing this can ignore the ways that gendered norms interact with the circumstances that force them to eschew them, right? So Black women might be criticized for failing to satisfy certain white female gender roles under patriarchy, and then considered less of a woman or not seen as a woman by maybe the men around her or by the society in which she operates. Another feminist concern in which being a Black woman conflicts sometimes with the primarily white feminist pursuits or framing is the issue of rape. So one issue here, if you look at the discourses involved or around rape, one issue is that rape under patriarchal law really is there to establish the bounds of normative sexuality and in regulating female sexual behavior. So from a white feminist view, rape law or anti-rape law is there really to protect property interests that men have in women's chastity. It's rarely there to protect women. It's largely there to protect male interest in women's chastity. And if you think of perhaps contemporary cases where you have police departments that refuse to fully test all of their rape kits, that can be an extension that suggests that maybe there's a lack of care or concern for rape of women. The point for white feminists here is that those rape laws were not really there to protect women. But for Black women, they're not particularly included in this kind of framing. So for Black women, there's really been no institutional effort to regulate, quote, Black female chastity. And in some cases, courts are advised to see that Black women are not chaste at all. And this is an important point. The idea of Black women sexuality is going to come back up again when we talk about misogynoir, coined by Moya Bailey. So stay tuned for that. While unchaste women are outside the laws of protection, so women who are prostitutes and whatnot, racism has restored a fallen white woman's chastity where the alleged assailant was a Black man. So Black women are put at this level from a patriarchal perspective of, say, prostitute, or they're in the same category of people who are unchaste, whose chastity or virginal qualities or bodily integrity are not worth protecting. Whereas white women actually do have a leg up against Black women under a patriarchal and white supremacist circumstance where the alleged assailant is a Black man. So much of the, many of the instances of lynching and violence against Black men was at the charge of, or followed a charge of, a Black man being sexual with a white woman or raping a white woman or fear thereof. So certain anti-rape laws actually serve a white supremacist goal to suppress a particular minority, in this case, Black minority. Now, there might be that kind of quote-unquote protection for white women, but there is no such restoration available to Black women. And so this is an instance where one's race greatly changes the way that one experiences particular feminist goals. And furthermore, when Black women are raped, they're not being raped as women generally, but as Black women specifically. So Crenshaw gives this nice way of framing it, that their femaleness made them sexually vulnerable to racist domination. And then their Blackness denied them any kind of protection, a consequent of that action. So Black women are not only experiencing those elements, but also they are caught between their own experiences and those of Black men, who consistently experience violence that's justified, quote unquote, by the threat, quote unquote, that Black men pose to white women's chastity. The protection of white female sexuality is often the pretext for terrorizing the Black community. If you watch The Birth of a Nation, for example, one of the core pieces of drama there is that a white woman is being assaulted by a Black man, and she would rather jump off a cliff than have that happen, and then the Ku Klux Klan goes after the Black man and quote unquote, brings him to justice by killing him. So there's this tug, right, for Black women. That's a particular struggle that has been, according to Crenshaw, ignored by white feminists. Black women find issues in knowing how to incorporate their gender into broader concerns of the Black community, and this constructs a tension. So the community sees that perhaps race is the primary oppositional force in Black lives, but by consequence, Black women's goals and issues are sidelined or ignored. And so Black women are in this real tough bind on this view that Black women are ignored by feminists because of their Blackness, because their Blackness makes their experience as women different than white feminists. And then they're ignored by the Black community by virtue of their womanness or their gender, and perhaps their goals or the things that are particularly concerning their gender are sidelined for the pursuits of alleviating racial oppression, as that's taken to be a more important goal than alleviating racial oppression in the way that it affects Black women in particular.